Hey guys, this is the first video in a new series that I want to try out on my YouTube channel. I think I'm going to call it The History of Statistics, and I want to make a couple videos that are a little bit different from the normal tutorial videos that I make, in that I want to talk a little bit about certain topics that I think are interesting. So sometimes there are people or events that have happened related to statistics, and I have learned about them and thought it was interesting for whatever reason, and I think I want to start or make a YouTube series about this. So my first attempt is going to be with this video, which I think I'm tentatively, we'll see what the final title is, but I'm tentatively calling it The Rise and Fall of the Iris Dataset. So this is a very famous dataset that's often used in statistics or data science or data visualization classes, and I wanted to talk about the history behind this dataset because I think it's interesting. So without further ado, let me go ahead and get started with the video. So I'm going to begin with some background of where this dataset came from. So this is a picture of a man named Edgar Shannon Anderson. So sometimes he goes in publications by Edgar Anderson or E.S. Anderson, and he was an American botanist. So he collected this data and first talked about this very famous iris flower dataset in a paper published in 1935, and the paper was called The Irises of the Gaspe Peninsula, and it was published in this Bulletin of the American Iris Society. For a couple of these things that I mentioned in this video, I'll try to put a link to them in the description box below. I was able to find the paper online, and it's a very simple 3-page paper. He basically spends a lot of time just talking about how he has been traveling and collecting measurements on different irises across the world. So this is where the Gaspe Peninsula is, which is where he collected the data for this paper. This is a picture that I found on Google Images. And in this paper, he wasn't really very scientific. It was kind of a very short paper where he spends a lot of time saying that the countryside in Canada is very pretty and there were lots of flowers, but he doesn't actually publish the data in this paper, and he doesn't really do any statistical analyses either. He just kind of mentions that he has been collecting data as a botanist for the past 10 years, and specifically he's been collecting data on irises. The reason he mentions towards the end of the paper is that he has been collecting these data, or what he calls dry statistics, because he wants to test out the theory of evolution or provide data in support of the theory of evolution. So he collects data for 2 different species of irises found in the Gaspe Peninsula, and he says that within a species there is individual variation. So when he collects measurements, for example, on the size of these flowers, every flower is going to have a slightly different size to it, but he says that he believes that the variation within a species should be less or smaller than the variation between species. So the differences between different species of irises should be greater than the individual variation within a species. And so this is why he has been collecting that data. He says in the paper, "For that reason I have studied such irises as I could get to see in as great detail as possible, measuring iris standard after iris standard and iris fall after iris fall, sitting squat-legged with record book and ruler in mountain meadows, in cypress swamps, on lake beaches, and in English parks." So it's a very old paper, it's not very scientific, and it actually doesn't provide the data at all. It kind of is just almost like a journal entry just saying, hey, I've been collecting this data. Well, this data set ended up becoming one of the most popular data sets in statistics because 1 year later, it was published in a paper by Ronald A. Fisher, who is basically considered the modern-day father of statistics. So he publishes this data in a paper a year later, in 1936, called The Use of Multiple Measurements in Taxonomic Problems. I believe I read briefly that E.S. Anderson got some kind of money, I think a fellowship or a scholarship or something, to study in the UK, and so that's how he ended up meeting Ronald Fisher. And Ronald Fisher also used to study plants a lot. Today he would be known basically as a biologist, and so that's how they made that connection. And so he mentions, Ronald Fisher in his paper mentions that he got the data set from E.S. Anderson. And the data set was as follows. There were 50 observations on 4 measurements of irises. So E.S. Anderson actually only measured 2 species of irises in Canada. So he measured Iris setosa and Iris versicolor, but in the Ronald Fisher paper, there were 3 species of irises. So there was a 3rd species that he found observations for, and this was Iris virginica. So actually, when I skimmed this paper, it wasn't really clear to me where he got this 3rd species from, but he does say in the paper that it was separate from the Canada region. So like I mentioned a little while earlier, Ronald Fisher ended up becoming one of the most famous statisticians of all time. So any paper that he published would be widely read and widely cited. So because in this paper, he published both an analysis of the data and also just a data table with the complete data set, the iris flower dataset ended up becoming one of the most famous datasets in statistics. Back then, and even today, it's still very widely used. So in this next slide, I just have some sample data visualizations from publications or tutorials I found online that use the iris flower dataset. In the original 1936 paper, what Ronald Fisher used the dataset for was actually to talk about a statistical method called linear discriminant analysis, or LDA. So I have a data visualization of what that looks like. And the iris flower dataset is commonly used basically to test different clustering algorithms. It's commonly used for clustering and other statistical methods as a very simple toy example or toy dataset. As further proof that it's a very common dataset, the iris flower dataset has its own Wikipedia page, and it's also one of the few datasets that is pre-loaded into R. So once you install R, you don't need an R package to load in the iris flower dataset. It's one of the pre-packaged R datasets that you can get with any R installation. I also checked Google Scholar to see how many citations there were for the Ronald Fisher paper, and it says that there are over 19,500 citations for this paper. Some of those citations might be for linear discriminant analysis, but I think the majority of those are for people using the iris flower dataset that was published as a data table in that paper. And I also checked the citations for the original Edgar Anderson paper, and there are over 1,000 citations for that paper as well. I think I've shown that this became a very famous dataset. However, in the last couple of years, there's been a huge fall in the number of people who use the iris dataset, and a lot of people have been calling publicly for the end of using the iris flower dataset. So in the next part of the video, I want to talk about why people do not want others to use that dataset anymore. And the main reason is where Ronald Fisher published this flower dataset. So if you see here, this 1936 paper that he wrote about flowers and a statistical method, he published in a journal called the Annals of Eugenics. Actually, that journal does not exist anymore, and today it's called the Annals of Human Genetics. But at the time, Ronald Fisher, he was a professor, but he was not a professor of statistics because at the time, statistics departments at universities did not exist. So he actually used to study biology a lot, and he was a professor in a department called the Department of Eugenics. And this is a very controversial part of the history of Ronald Fisher, which is to say that he was a proponent of eugenics, which if you don't know what that is, you can look it up, but basically it's a very racist way of trying to say that certain races of people are smarter or better than others. And so today it's completely considered a pseudoscience, and a lot of really bad people in history were proponents or users of eugenics, and they used it to do really bad things. So basically what ended up happening with the iris flower dataset is it obviously has nothing to do with eugenics in the racist sort of way. I mean, it's not even talking about people, it's talking about flowers. But I've noticed a trend being a couple years ago, people have rang the alarm about citing this paper, because if you cite this paper, even though the journal doesn't exist anymore, people would be citing in their own papers a journal of eugenics. And so since a couple years ago, people have been saying, hey, it's not a good idea to cite from this journal because eugenics is not considered a science and it's very widely denounced nowadays, as it should be. And so unfortunately, the flower dataset that has, again, nothing to do with eugenics has kind of had this bad reputation placed on it because of where the dataset comes from and where you would have to cite the dataset coming from if you want to use it in a paper. This is just a couple examples of screenshots I have seen because a lot of people, not only do people not use the dataset, but they have been very vocal about telling other people, hey, I have stopped using this dataset, you should stop using the dataset as well. And so I've seen on statistics Twitter a lot of people saying, don't use that dataset anymore because of its association with eugenics. On Reddit, someone asked, is it socially acceptable to use the iris dataset? And actually, when I was looking into research about this topic for this video, I even found a publication that was talking about some problems with the iris dataset, and I thought I was going to mention this association with eugenics, but I actually found a paper that said there's another problem with the dataset, which is the measurements, and it said that certain botanists actually disagreed that iris flowers have sepals. I think that's how you pronounce that word, sepals. So I read a paper thinking that the problem was going to be about the eugenics, like a lot of people talk about on Twitter, but actually there are other problems that people have with the data set as well. So some people argue, and I have no idea about this because I have no background in botany at all, but some of the measurements, some people argue, are not even part of that flower. So I don't even know if that's true or not, but I found that in a research paper that was published. So these are some examples of the controversy with this flower data set. For me, what I remember during this time a couple years ago when people started talking about this, actually the most famous example that I thought of people saying that we should not be referencing Ronald Fisher anymore was actually from the American Statistical Association. And so they have a very famous kind of award and lecture that they called the Ronald A. Fisher Award and Lectureship. And so this would be awarded annually to a really famous statistician. And it was kind of a big award, and this is a very big organization. And so a couple years ago, people were talking about not using the name Ronald Fisher for the award, and this was again tied to his relationship and his advocacy for eugenics. The last that I remember from this whole discussion and controversy was that a lot of people wanted to change the name from Ronald Fisher to David Blackwell. For this video, I looked it up again and I found that they had made a change.org petition that had over 8,000 signatures. And David Blackwell, for those of you who don't know, is a very famous African-American statistician. He was a very great statistician, like a total genius. I actually want to make a video about him in the History of Statistics series if I continue this. We'll see how that goes. But he has a very interesting history and kind of biography to him. But I remember that was the last thing I kind of heard about this news. And then when I looked it up for this video, they ended up just removing the name altogether. So they didn't change the name in reference to David Blackwell, but they also did remove Ronald Fisher from the name. So I think now it's just called the COPS Award. Like the ASA was too afraid to name it after any person unless they get canceled in the future. So I think I don't know the reason that they didn't want to change it to David Blackwell, but they ended up ignoring the petition, but also removing the reference to Ronald Fisher because he's now kind of a controversial. Him and a lot of other white statisticians who were early founders of statistics are now, people are trying to move away from naming things after them because they're ties to racist ideology. Now, to end this video, I wanted to talk about an alternative dataset that you can use instead of the iris flower dataset. So one of the reasons I wanted to make this video was because I actually think it's kind of an interesting story that an iris flower dataset collected from Canada that has nothing to do with race ended up being associated with racism and people saying you can't use this flower dataset because it's racist. I don't know, I think the history behind that is kind of funny, although I do agree that we shouldn't be citing from the eugenics journal. So anyway, I've seen different people say or propose different datasets to use instead of the iris dataset because honestly the iris dataset is not that interesting and it's not that intricate, but the number one alternative that I have seen that people propose is called the Palmer penguins dataset. So these are measurements from 3 different species of penguins that you can find in Antarctica, and Palmer is a reference to a research station in Antarctica. I think it's owned by the United States. And so you can do, again, it's 3 species, just like the 3 species of iris flowers, and it's just different measurements of like their bill and other things. I don't even know all the variables, but this is a very commonly used data set that's people have actually really pushed this idea of using this penguin data set instead of the iris data set, and they have even made these cute little drawings for the penguins as well. And the good news is if you cite the penguins data set, the citation has no reference to eugenics, and so you can do basically the same thing without having to cite the annals of eugenics. And anyway, that's all I wanted to discuss for this video. We'll see if I make another history of statistics video, but anyway, thank you for watching.